Hello, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or good whatever time of night or day it happens to be wherever you happen to be. Welcome to Republic News. I am your hostess, Liviana. In 1948, to be precise, on the 13th of September, 1948, Henry Wallace Jr. gave a radio address. And so for those of you who don't know who Henry A. Wallace Jr. was, he was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second vice president, serving in the office from 1941 until 1945. Henry Wallace's first vice president had been a Southern conservative Democrat, and it was somewhat customary for a long time for a Northern president of the Democratic Party to select a Southern Democrat to run as his vice presidential running mate. So when Franklin Roosevelt ran his first term, 1932, he chose a Southern Democrat to run with him. And again, in 1936, he chose a Southern Democrat to run with him, the same vice president that he had during his first term. Now, in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt first took office as president, he appointed Henry A. Wallace Jr. as his Secretary of Agriculture. Wallace had supported the New Deal program from the beginning, but at the time that he was appointed to be Secretary of Agriculture in 1933, he was a progressive Republican. By 1936, I think it was in 1936, he switched party affiliations and became a Democrat, a progressive Democrat. It was about the same time that Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president broke with him completely. He had opposed the New Deal from the beginning, and in 1936 he had basically had enough. But nevertheless, he served out his term as vice president, his second term. So in 1940, when Roosevelt was running for his third term as president, he wanted to select Henry Wallace to be his vice presidential running mate. Now, Wallace, having been a Republican in the past, was not very well liked by the Democratic Party establishment. On top of that, Wallace was opposed to segregation and both race and sex discrimination. This is something that the Democratic Party wasn't down with at the time because, well, the Democrats had been the party of the Southern plantation owners at first. And they were also associated with merchants in towns after that time, as well as the landed gentry of the South. And there was still a fairly strong Democratic majority in the South at the time. Now, this would later change with the Dixiecrats, so-called Dixiecrats, formed their own political party briefly. Didn't succeed. But after Lyndon Johnson signed the two Civil Rights Acts, a large number of the Dixiecrats defected from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, which was an interesting choice since President Dwight David Eisenhower, known more familiarly as Ike, the Republican president, had federalized the National Guard in order to enforce desegregation in Central High School in Little Rock. At any rate, Franklin Roosevelt told the Democratic Party establishment that he would not run for re-election if he couldn't have Henry Wallace as his vice presidential running mate in 1940, and so the party establishment relented. Roosevelt got his vice president, the vice president he wanted, Henry Wallace. So Henry Wallace became Franklin Roosevelt's second vice president. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt was weakened by illness and didn't have the strength really to fight the establishment Democrats, who at this point insisted that Wallace be done away with, and they wanted Truman to take his place. So that did in fact happen. 1944 election, Franklin Roosevelt ran for president for his fourth term with Harry Truman as his vice presidential running mate. Upon taking office, or upon having succeeded himself or whatever, and become president again in 1945, Franklin Roosevelt then named Henry Wallace his Secretary of Commerce. And of course, Roosevelt died before he completed his fourth term, and Truman kept Wallace on as Secretary of Commerce until the differences between them became so pronounced that Truman fired Henry Wallace from that position in 1946. Subsequently, Henry Wallace, who had experience as a newspaper editor, became the editor-in-chief of the New Republic, a magazine which had been founded in 1913 by progressives, by the historical progressives. And the historical progressive movement lasted from the 1890s, around 1890, 1891, until more or less the end of World War II. I mean, they had kind of dispersed back into either Republican or Democratic Party in the 20s, but the progressive ideal never really went away. And in fact, Franklin Roosevelt had proposed a second Bill of Rights, which was a very progressive document. Unfortunately, it was not approved. When Wallace became when he became the editor of the New Republic, he used that platform as a sort of a soapbox to attack Truman relentlessly over a number of things, including the Cold War, which Wallace never supported. In 1948, Wallace left his position as editor of the New Republic, having founded a new progressive party, the Progressive Party, in 1948, and it lasted until about 1960. But in 1948, Henry Wallace was their presidential nominee, so he did run for president on the Progressive Party ticket in 1948. So, as I said, on the 13th of September of that year, he delivered a radio address at NBC. And this was a part of his presidential campaign. So, I would like to read to you the text of former Vice President Henry Agard Wallace Jr.'s radio address from that date. I have been in the South so many times, and every time I have found many new things, but never were my eyes opened so widely as on my last trip. It is a strange experience to stand on the main street of an American town and to ask only for the right to speak, and to be denied that right. It is a strange experience to look into faces blinded by unreasoning hate, to see people who will not let you speak, when the words concern the improvement of the lives of the very people before you. Yes, I have seen the South many times. The thousands of unpainted shacks, the families living in houses with no doors in the door frames, and no windows in the window frames, where a man and his family sleep in one room, all of them sleeping in one bed in cold weather, the children sleeping on the floor in warm weather. The people of the South are fine people. Our aspirations are their aspirations. They are a patriotic people, a religious people. And it is this that struck me on my recent trip, that the basic human need of the South is simply a reconciling of our daily action with what we are taught in the church and what we are taught in school. The foundation of patriotism and religion is the doctrine of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. The brotherhood of man sets forth no limitation of color. The Constitution of the United States sets forth very specifically that the rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied on account of race or color. I came out of the South utterly convinced that these denials of God and man are evils which can cost this nation its very life, and I am as thoroughly convinced that these evils can be eliminated without violence to the greater glory of America. You read the press accounts of my trip. The papers told you eggs were thrown at me. They told you I was booed. You read that in some cities local authorities would not permit me to talk to free American meetings to unsegregated audiences. All of this is true, but it was not the real headline. The real headline is that it is possible to do what some said was impossible, to hold unsegregated meetings in every southern state and to hold them without incident. For example, in Memphis, where the Freedom Train could not stop because it was said that unsegregated audiences viewing the great documents of American history would cause incident, would produce racial violence. In that city I spoke to a meeting of several thousands, Negroes and whites, and there was no incident. I spoke to friendly, courteous crowds in Virginia, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, yes, in each of the 7 southern states I visited. No, the headlines about egg throwing misrepresented the good people of the South. For you see, we did not invade a hostile territory as some would have you think. We came at the invitation of brave and courageous Southerners who have been fighting for decades to bring constitutional guarantees to their part of the country. Our trip merely focused attention on what has been in the South for the past 100 years, a deep, thoroughgoing desire for people to live out their lives in dignity and equality. That, I think, is the real headline. There comes to mind a small businessman who lives in Hickory, North Carolina. He makes chair frames. He employs 15 or 20 men. He had a great hope that the meeting in Hickory would be a success, and when we got through with the meeting, it had been a rather violent one, I asked, "How do you explain that?" He answered, "Well, I know these people here, and I am sure that if you had a chance to speak to them individually, face to face, 90% of them would agree with your program." But, you will ask, if people wanted to hear me speak, why couldn't they? Let me answer by saying the worst attempts at disruption occurred in mill towns of North Carolina, where the majority of spindles are owned by northern corporations. It was in the steel towns of Alabama, dominated by northern capital, where people were denied their constitutional rights of free assembly. For when we came to the TVA areas of Alabama and Tennessee, there we received courteous and friendly receptions, for these people had learned that more income for small people meant more income for all the people, for farmers, for workers, for small businessmen, for Negroes, for whites. They were beginning to appreciate that segregation means wage differentials for the South, means lower wages for Southern labor, means lower living standards for Southern people. Yes, the same labor that brings $1 an hour in Grand Rapids, Michigan, brings only 50 cents in some of the towns where I tried to speak. The meaning of segregation can be summed up in the fact that the average annual income in the South is $500 or more below the rest of the country. It is this, then, the wage differential and the depressed standard of living, that we challenged on our Southern trip. And what was it I tried to say? What was it that so inflamed people that they forgot the mandates of the Constitution and the injunctions of God? I said that the situation in the South imperils the North as much as the South. Indeed, it imperils the very life of our nation. I said that hate is a dangerous thing because it can be controlled and used against the people. I said that hate, also of a racist origin, had been used in Germany by Hitler, and this was a great danger to all Americans. And I said that a comprehensive program of improvement for the South would greatly strengthen both the South and the nation. I set forth that program, a program of unification of the South, white and black, behind an economic program, a sound financial and economic program that would put Tennessee Valley authorities on all rivers, that would result in greater appropriations for schools, for hospitals, for making available more abundant fertilizer at lower prices. I said it was possible to increase the yield of cotton and other crops, to protect and encourage the small farmer, especially the 1,400,000 white sharecroppers and the 1 million Negro sharecroppers who suffer today in such a terrible way. I said I wanted to end wage differentials in the South so that if labor is worth $1 an hour in the North, the same labor is worth $1 in the South. I said I wanted to make certain that a man was paid according to his work and not penalized for the color of his skin or the section of the country in which he lives. I said I would like to see twice as high an income from agriculture in the South and twice as much industry. I proposed a program of government spending in the South in the amount of $1 billion a year for the next 4 years. I urged that only a tiny fraction of the funds now being spent to re-Nazify Germany, to remilitarize Japan, to support the anti-democratic governments of Greece, Turkey, and China, be put to work for the good of the people of the South and the good of America. I proposed less help to the feudal lords of the Arabian states in their war on the Jewish people, and more to the democratic people of the South in their war on pellagra and soil erosion. And it was these proposals, always my proposals for constructive projects, which provoked the attacks. These were the ideas that brought out the eggs and the hate. I repeat, I came out of the South with the utter conviction that segregation, racial prejudice, and Jim Crow can cost America its life. For these evils are not simply problems of the South. No, the lynchings and knifing of Negroes in the South have their counterparts in every part of our country. A mob wrecks a Negro's home in Detroit. Police run down citizens of Harlem. Mexican Americans are railroaded to jail in Los Angeles. In northern restaurants, in western schools, in midwestern hospitals, it is the same, and even the children's genes are infected. In the nation's capital, the marble tournament to determine who is the best player in Washington does not allow competition between Negro and white children. I say our failure to live by the Constitution, our failure to abolish segregation, strikes at the roots of America. This is an issue above politics, for whatever denies the freedom of the Negro destroys the freedom of the whites. Pity the persecuted, but pity the persecutor more. It is a cancer that eats into the very moral fiber of the American people. And the eyes of the world are upon us. The colonial peoples of the world are watching us, assessing us by our treatment of Negroes and other minorities, and they ask, what do Americans really mean by democracy? Do we mean the democracy of Mississippi where 0.3% of the Negro citizens vote? Do we mean the democracy of Tom Dewey, who would restore the Italian bankers to their former positions of empire as rulers of the colored people of Africa? Do we mean the democracy of Harry Truman, who proclaims a non-segregation policy for the Army and sits by while his Southern Secretary of the Army deliberately violates the policy? Which is the true policy, the world is asking? The words or the deeds? I have said I believe in the brotherhood of man and in the Constitution, but I do not suggest that more preachment of the doctrine of love can straighten out some of the denials of the brotherhood of man in the South. No, certain violations of the words of God may have to be stopped by legislation, and while you cannot legislate love, you can legislate against certain acts of hate. I used to think that time, long drawn-out time, would handle these evils. But since World War II, I know that time is far, far shorter than it used to be. I know that today we are in desperate need of a solution which respects the dignity of the human soul, and the old parties cannot give us this solution even if they would, for Mr. Dewey's party is the party of corporations whose profits are rooted in discrimination, the party of wage differentials. And Mr. Truman's party is held together with the cement of discrimination. Both are parties of profit, and they have found prejudice a profitable business. No, the solution lies in a break with the old parties. It lies in organizing what is best in American life, the deeply felt religious and patriotic urges of the people all over America. Yesterday there was tragic news from Georgia. The 28-year-old father of 6 children, Isaiah Newton, was shot to death in front of his family because he had insisted on using his citizen's right to vote. When I read the story of Isaiah Newton, I was reminded of a story they tell in the South, of a story which reveals the spirit that will free the South. It was in the same state of Georgia just 2 years ago that a young Negro veteran named Maceo Snipes learned that, by Supreme Court ruling, he had a right to vote. No Negro had voted in his county since Reconstruction, but Maceo Snipes went down and registered. The following morning he was sitting on his porch and a white man came up and killed him with a shotgun. His funeral was held the next day, and in the midst of the funeral oration, Maceo's mother rose and moved up through the crowd up to his coffin, where they waited to lower it into the earth. And she asked for her second son to come forth. He was 17, and she said to him, "Put your hand on this coffin and swear on the body of your brother that when you get to be 21, you're going down to the courthouse to do what he did, to vote." If you ask me the meaning of the Progressive Party, I should say it is this: we are dedicated to seeing that the 6 children of Isaiah Newton shall vote and live as free Americans, and that all today's children shall have the opportunities which our Constitution, our Christian tradition, and our great resources make possible. If you have enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the bell to be notified of all new content. If you really like what I do here on my YouTube channel and at my publication, The Progressive Flame, please consider becoming my patron through Patreon. The link will be found in the video description. Until next time, have fun, but stay safe. For Republic News, this is Liviana, signing off.